Sorry, sorry, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Check, check.
and landscapes, we must rise to the challenge of fighting climate change.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to convene our meeting. We're having a meeting today, information session with the State Department of Education, and this is a meeting of the new Select Committee on Special Education on Monday, February 24th. So looking forward to hearing more. We've just wrapped up a series of listening tours, and it was really wonderful for this committee to be in the community, listening to the needs of particularly parents and teachers and superintendents and members of boards of education, and to try to get a real understanding of what we need to do to intervene at this moment in special education to make sure not only that we're meeting all of the needs of our students, but that we're creating a system that is sustainable. And so we're looking at structures that make sense. We're looking at what we should prioritize in terms of interventions, thinking about special education as part of a continuum of education from early education, general education, special education as a part of that all the way through a transition program, and what can that look like going forward, which is the work that we are doing now. So let me open it up first with to ask my co-chair and any our ranking members to see whether they have any comments.
No comments. Thank you.
Right. Okay. All right. So we just thank you very much to members of the State Board of Education for being here today. This is I'm sure we'll have some questions from the committee. A number of things have come up, but if you wanted to start with your own remarks and comments, things that we should be considering, and then we'll open it up for questions going forward in terms of placements and costs and things like that. And if you can please introduce yourselves and make sure the mic is on if you're sitting.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Klimkowitz. I'm the Special Education Division Director for the State Department of Education, here along with my colleague.
Ajit Gopalakrishnan, Chief Performance Officer for the Department of Education.
So we prepared a few slides for you to just put in context some high-level information around special education across the state, as well as some detailed information about the excess cost grant and how that works. And I do have the presentation here, but I notice it's not projecting on the screen. So are folks able to see that online?
Or just give us 1 minute. We're just working on.
Thank you for your patience. Appreciate it. So as I mentioned, I was just going to share a little bit about the State Department of Education and the awesome responsibility that we have as the state education agency in working towards improved outcomes for students with disabilities. So this is just a snapshot of the team that we have at the department. It's come up a couple of different times. We have 3 distinct units within the Bureau of Special Education, one overseeing our dispute resolution system. That team works on fielding all of our administrative complaints related to special education. We also provide mediation, where we hire neutral mediators to assist when there's disagreements between the school district and the families, as well as due process hearings. And so within that unit, we are proactively providing training, information, resources to educators and parents so that they understand their rights and understand the special education process. Our second unit in the department, we work collaboratively to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. And we manage what's called the State Performance Plan. It's a 6-year plan that we submit to the federal government on 18 different indicators in special education, all with the goal of improving our educational and social emotional outcomes for our students. And then finally, we oversee federal grants for our school districts. Our local agencies and the individual teams that support our parents. And so collectively and collaboratively, we look to improve those outcomes for our students so that they can be successful once they leave public school. I know you all had a presentation a while back from OLR regarding special education overview in general. Just wanted to mention the really key provisions of the IDA that our students are entitled to a free, appropriate public education within the least restrictive environment. And that environment is there's an array of services and supports that the districts need to provide to a student based on their individualized needs. A little bit about special education, and I've heard the discussions here with the committee, and I know that you're aware, but the individualization that occurs, specially designed instruction is really what special education is, and to be provided to students and families at no cost to meet those unique needs of students with a disability. And the planning and placement team design annual goals and objectives for those students based on their needs. And they are aligned with general education expectations and high expectations for all students. This year within our state data system, we've rolled out a grade level alignment with each goal and objective for the student so that they're meeting or reaching for those grade level objectives and goals. A little bit about the birth to 3 transition to public education. It's important to point out that those are different sets of laws within the IDA. They are not the same, hence the apple and the orange. There are different criteria and different provisions and different services within Part C, birth to 3, to our public school setting. Part B entails and protects students at the age of 3 all the way through the end of the school year in which a student turns 22, or until they receive their regular high school diploma, whichever comes first. When we're talking about special education eligibility, we are looking kind of at a 3-pronged approach of, does the student have a disability? Does that disability adversely affect their education, whether that's academically or non-academically? And then does the child require specially designed instruction? Just a visual for you. I know you've talked a lot about prevalence rates in Connecticut that have been on the rise. So here's a snapshot from 2007, 2008, where as a state, you can see we were at 11.5%, and that steady increase over the years to over 17% currently. What's important to understand as well is that during that time, there's been a decrease in the general education population. So that speaks to the higher percentage of reason for that, but there are other reasons as well for those percentages to increase. So this slide just demonstrates the increase year over year in our special education identification and the downward trend for all students in K-12 and the rate of change. So on average, year over year during that time, special education prevalence rates have increased by 2.5%. There have been some higher years and some lower years, but that's the on average. I also wanted to share some data regarding least restrictive environment. We are speaking about students who, here in this slide, who are educated alongside students without an IEP in the general education setting at least 80% of their day or more. And you can see the variety of disability categories. This slide also speaks to that same statistics. And you can see that students with speech and language impairment and/or students with learning disabilities have a higher percentage of time with non-disabled peers, for example, than students with intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, and autism. Finally, before we turn it over to Ajit Gopalakrishnan, I wanted to also show you a visual related to the percentage of students that are included in or serviced out of the school district or are in public schools, but from 0% of their day to 40% of their day. So in other words, more restrictive settings. Again, you can see the variety of disability categories, whereas students with emotional disabilities are placed out at higher rates out of the district when compared to other disability categories. But as mentioned, we're happy to answer any questions and dive in a little bit more deep, depending on the questions that you have with each of these data points. At this point, I'll turn it over to Ajit.
Thanks, Brian. I believe that the request was to get an understanding of how the excess cost grant actually works, the entitlement, how it actually works. So I'm here to sort of walk you through the calculation steps so you can understand like how it actually, districts end up getting what they get. These are obviously governed by 10-76G, and the excess cost reimburses districts for special education costs that exceed 4.5 times the net current expenditures per pupil from the prior year for that district. So each district has a net current expenditures per pupil that the department calculates. And if the individual student's costs exceeds 4.5 times that, then anything over that 4.5 times is what they can seek reimbursement for. So I've got some examples just to illustrate this. So imagine District A, their per pupil, net current expenditures per pupil is 20,000, and they have 2 special education students with very high costs. Let's say student 1 has a cost of 120,000 and student 2 has a cost of 140,000. Because the net current expenditures is 20,000, 4.5 times that is 90,000. So in the case of student 1, they can seek reimbursement for the difference between 90 and 120, so that's the 30,000. And then for student 2, it'll be 90 to 140, that'll be the 50,000. So they can seek reimbursement for 80,000. Okay, so that's what the excess cost grant covers, or request covers. The grant is a capped grant, and this is by law. So what cap basically means is that we can only work with what money has been allocated, appropriated by the legislature, and it's an entitlement grant. Entitlement means that the district doesn't have to submit a traditional grant application for it. They don't have to submit goals and objectives and milestones and things like that. It's really just, here's our student, here's the cost, give us the money kind of thing. I mean, so it is an entitlement, and it's capped, meaning that we can't pay more than what we have. And by law, we're required to pay the districts. The districts actually must submit data twice. They submit initially December 1st, and then they do the final submission by March 1st. And that usually happens because some students data they're cleaning up, or they get better information, or whatever the case may be. So they send us the first batch by December 1st, and then catch up by March 1st. And by law, we're required to pay out 75% of their preliminary capped award in February, and the balance is paid in May. Was there a question? Okay, I was just. That's correct. So if it's.
Sorry, Representative Zufkus, if you want to, if you have a question through the.
My question was to my ranking member quietly, but the question was the ECS is not fully funded all the time. The excess cost is not fully funded. It depends on the fund versus the ECS formula grant.
Right. This is, no relation to ECS here. So it's strictly just excess cost.
I was
Yeah,
just
we
saying
just
my
basically.
ranking member's correct.
Yep. So we. No, that's all right. Okay. So I'm going to give you 2 scenarios of how this, again, these are still illustrative data. That's what I'm really using here to show you how this worked prior to 22-23 and how it works from 22-23 onward, because this notion of tiers comes in 22-23. So I just want to explain like how the tiering thing actually works. So this is the example of prior to 22-23, when there was no tiering. And in this case, we have 3 districts, A, B, and C, in the table. And each district is requesting how much ever they're requesting for their students. And here we're not talking students, we're talking the total request. So District A is requesting 700,000, District B is requesting 400,000, and District C is requesting 150,000, adds up to 1.25 million. And let's say that in this example, the appropriation is only 900,000, right? So we don't have enough to give everybody what they want. We reduce their appropriations proportionally. And so essentially, we are short 350,000, and that's 28% how short we are. We're short by 28%. So every district gets reduced by 28%. And so the district gets 72% of whatever their quote uncapped request is. So District A requested 700,000, but they're reduced by 28% and they get 504,000. And B, 400,000, they get proportionally reduced. So that's essentially how the math worked prior to 22-23. The math gets a little complicated, but the principle is essentially the same with the tiering. So what the tiering did was it established 3 tiers based on the wealth ranking of the municipality. And it said that, you know, the least wealth ranking, the poorest towns, the reimbursement rate would be, the tier would be 91%. The next set of towns would be 88%, and the next set of towns would be 85%. So, but the law also states that if after applying the tiers, the total request still exceeds the available appropriation, then we have to reduce proportionally, again, because we can't pay what we don't have. So continuing the example from the prior example, those 3 districts, right? The A, B, and C coming up to 1.25 million. In this case, let's say District A is in Tier 1, District B is in Tier 2, and District C is in Tier 3. The way the math now works is we apply the tier first. So the 700,000, we apply 91% of that, and we get the 637,000. That's like the tiered reimbursement amount. So we do that for all 3 districts based on whichever tier they're in. So District B, again, hypothetically in Tier 2, District C, hypothetically in Tier 3. You come up with what their tiered reimbursement is. You add the tiered reimbursement up, in this case, that middle column, and that comes up to 1,116,500. We still only have 900,000, right? So we can't pay out what we don't have. So after the tiers are applied, we have to reduce proportionally again. So now we do the same math, and we now, instead of everybody getting a 28%, we apply the tier, and now we have to reduce everybody by 19%, 19.39 in this case. So you then deduct everybody, and then you come up with the allocation
And
for
sorry,
each
can I
district.
just ask a quick question about that?
Absolutely.
Why does the initial tier, the highest tier, why does it start at 91% instead of 100%?
That's in law.
What's the rationale for that? Like we're starting already not guaranteeing 100% reimbursement?
I am not sure what
Okay.
the intent, sorry.
Okay. Because then it would go down from there, I understand. And then it's already based on the allocation. So I
Right.
wasn't sure why the 91% right off the bat.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
I
that's
don't
fine. I
have the
will follow up on
history
that.
on
Thank
it,
you.
But
We'll follow up and
okay.
maybe
Yeah,
someone else in the State Department can,
I'm not
as
sure.
long as there's, yeah,
I don't
I'll
know.
follow up on that.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. Yeah, I think the law does state that you have to apply the tiers, and then if it's not sufficient, you have to do proportional reduction. Yes, because this is a current year grant. That's the other thing too. Like we're trying to fulfill requests in a current year without knowing at the start of the year how much the request is going to be. So we don't really know what the total request is until really the March submission, which is when we have the final amounts for districts. So does that make it clear as to how the program works? Okay.
Understand how the
Okay,
formula, I
great.
just wasn't sure why we're
Why it
not
starts at 90.
starting, especially because after that it gets reduced anyway based on the allocation. So I'm not sure why it doesn't start 100 and then go down from there from the tiers. But I understand the way that it's being allocated based on sort of the percentages that are identified here. So yes, thank you.
Yep, sure. and I didn't put this, I don't think I have a slide on this, but when we looked at the numbers of students who are being requested for excess costs, because the district has to submit the actual student who is they're requesting this information for. So it's confidential information. But one observation I'll make is that the number of students who districts have submitted for excess cost reimbursement has been pretty consistent. I mean, there was a little fluctuation during the pandemic years, but the numbers are pretty consistent, around 4,300 students. But the per student, but the costs, the total costs has increased significantly, such that it's much higher now. So I just wanted to make that point. And I think our last slide is just to sort of close out by saying that, obviously, as you've seen in the governor's proposal, governor and the commissioner, there are really a multi-pronged strategy that we are taking. The $40 million allocation in the biennium budget, that's one. The $14 million investment, the 10 for operational and the 4 from capital for districts to provide in-district programming. So that's another strategy. The rate setting study is underway as well through our research collaborative through the University of Connecticut. And they are talking to other states as well as talking to Connecticut folks to understand how rate setting works, and all the ins and outs of that. And I believe there's also a proposal to make the tuition cost schedule transparent and early notification so that by December that is notified. So just wanted to just close out with that. We're trying to take sort of a comprehensive look at this. And of course, ECS is the other thing in the mix, in that the acceleration of the ECS full funding schedule timeline is also part of providing the resources to districts. So we'll pause and take any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Will you be able to share those slides so we can share with the committee? Great. We'll share with the committee and we'll post it on the committee website as well. Thank you. So I have a couple of questions and I'll open it up. I'm thinking we'll have a number of questions from our committee members. So the first thing on the formula, I think it's the last thing you said, which I think we all may have this question, that the number of students has been reported to us and we've heard from most districts has remained consistent, but the costs have significantly increased. And in fact, funding has increased too at the state level, but the spending is outpacing the funding that's been allocated. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is the basis for that? Why has the spending gone up so much, even though the student population that requires services, presumably similar services, has remained the same?
You want to jump in? I mean, I would just expect that the needs for the services are greater. That's one possible explanation, that there are greater needs for the students who are there. Other possible explanation is cost of services itself. So again, we don't have like a particular reason. I think we're just stating that it's not due to increase in number of students. It's not like a proportional increase. You know how if we had 3,000 students, now we have 4,000 students. That's why the numbers, that's not what's happening here.
Right.
So the reason why costs might be higher are probably many. I don't know, Brian, if you want to.
Yeah.
Sure. Just to add to that, so they would be many, the different reasons, but one thing I'd like to point out is like tuition. So most of our students that do meet that threshold for the 4.5 times above are in out of district settings. So when we're looking at transportation costs and tuition costs, those are kind of two major factors within the excess cost. That's not to say students in districts don't also or couldn't also meet that threshold, but there are less students with those intense needs. The other thing to consider is that due to the staffing shortage in special education for teachers, related service providers, it's forcing districts and schools to contract services out. When you're contracting services out and don't have your own staff, that's going to escalate the costs because those companies are charging fees on top of the services that are receiving. So, but as Ajit mentioned, there's a variety of reasons, but those are just some things to point to as driving those costs.
Thank you. And that's what we heard from a number of superintendents in particular is that the services required or the needs of the students actually didn't change. But in the last 2 years, for example, the cost from the outplacement providers significantly increased and sometimes increased in the middle of the budget year, which left them with a big hole to fill. And so one of the questions, and I'm also chair of the Government Oversight Committee, and we'll have these questions there because one of the questions is a question for what has the oversight been on these programs, because I mean, I understand we're looking into rate setting at this moment, but who has overseen the rates that have been provided? Has there been any oversight on that by the agency, by any agency, by any commission, about of the rates for programs? How did these, if you can say a little bit more about how the programs get approved, and has there been any oversight on what they're claiming are the necessary costs, and whether or not there's some accountability for whether those costs actually reflect the cost of services or there's just a markup, because we don't know that. So who would have that information?
Yeah, so I can describe our oversight for the standards approval process, but that does not include the rate setting that the programs are charging districts on an annual basis. They do have to show, and their budgets are audited. So there are a number of approved private special education programs that are nonprofit, and there are others that are for-profit. There are some that are run by entities that have very large programs, and others where that's their sole, like mom and pop, so to speak, where they have that passion to support students, often from a family member, and begin a program within that context. But we have a process where we're approving standards. The State Board of Education approved the standard approval process back in 2019. And so there's a variety of factors that we look at when we're approving schools. But they're private entities in that context. So each individual district has a contract and is required by law to have a contract in place to provide the services that the student needs. So that's really what drives that information. And that's a negotiation between the LEA, the local school district, and the entity in and of itself. So when we are going on site to do approvals and to do audits, we're looking to make sure that they have those contracts in place, they're signed by both entities, and that they're providing the services that the individualized students need.
Great, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Is anybody looking at the pricing though? I mean, has anybody looked to say this seems like a reasonable beyond the school district? And does the contract change mid-budget? Because what we heard from superintendents is they're getting an additional increase. Is that for a new contract year? Because it sounded like it was a surprise in the middle of a budget year. So are these contracts allowed to change? And given, I understand that these are public and private and sometimes quasi-public agencies, but these are state dollars going to those agencies. So I'd like to know if there's some oversight at the state level on the dollars that are being spent or contracted, or that's part of that contractual agreement, and whether that's something we're planning going forward, and whether that's been done in the past.
Yes. So the Office of Internal Audit is a separate entity within the department, and they, on an annual basis, will review 6 to 8 programs. And they're taking those deep dives that you're mentioning into service delivery, into contracts, making sure all the provisions that are there in law are actually being implemented, or those agreements are happening. I'm not an attorney, although I am in special education. So if a district has a contract with an entity and that contract is breached for some reason, I don't know the exact process that they're engaged in when those increases happen midway within a contract, but I would think that would be a negotiation between the school district and the program. And I know that has happened this year, specifically in January, most recently, for students who are placed in certain programs. So we also, as part of our standard approval process, we're looking at, the program's structure, their staffing, our staff, background checks, fingerprinting, all of the requirements that are for staffing purposes so that they're highly qualified to be able to deliver the services that they're asked to do by the school district. Our rate setting study, though, we are looking at other states, what they have in place around rate setting. We do actually set rates for programs that are attached to residential facilities in the state. We do have that process ongoing now. So there are a number or a smaller percentage of programs that we do and are involved in currently with those rates setting. But I think that part of our comprehensive package was to ensure that those rates were tuition rates were communicated upfront to districts so that they could plan for those costs within the budget process. So
And you said there's 6 to 8 or so annual audits. Would we be
Yeah.
able to, and does that just rotates? And does that,
It
is
does.
there a set number? And so how often then would each of these outplacement program, or each of the programs that are getting funding, is there sort of a time frame for how often they get reviewed?
Again, that's
For
a different
audited.
entity than I don't
Okay.
oversee that entity, but those reports are all publicly available.
Great.
And they're just finished this year's round of their audits. And as I mentioned, there's usually 6 to 8. They're not always all approved private special education programs. They do also look at private programs that are non-special education. So there's a mix or variety, but those do come out on an annual basis.
Thank you and
You're
I
welcome.
will turn it over to, I know there are other questions and I have a couple.
I just want to do a follow-up to that question specifically, and I'll ask my questions at the end. But so you said about 5 to 6 audits a year?
The most recent audit this year, I believe, was 8. So
Okay.
it's between 6 to 8 that
Okay.
they're looking at, and they're taking a deeper dive into their financial.
And we have 88 approved private special ed providers, correct?
Yes.
So, and the 8, the audits that we do are not just the approved, there are also some non-approved private schools that we
These are the
auditing.
audits that the Office of Internal Audit conducts, not the State Department.
Right,
Not the
no.
Bureau of Special
Right,
Education, but yeah.
right.
Yes.
So I'm saying, so those 8 that we had for this year, for example, they would
Mhm.
be some approved and they might be some unapproved, like private
I
special.
think there was
private-
one, of the 8.
Right. Okay. So just mathematically, because I'm trying to think of like how
Mhm.
often they would get audited. So if there's 8, even if let's just say they were all approved and there are 88 providers, that mean it would technically take 11 years for you to get audited again, right? Is my math? I do love math, but roughly it could take 11 years
That's
for you to get
excellent
audited
math.
again. And that's that's if they solely did approved private special ed.
Mhm.
I just wanted to point that number out. Thank
Yeah,
you, but-
Representative
yeah.
Khan, if I
Yeah,
may.
please go
So
ahead.
for as far as our approval process, we have a 6-year cycle where we're on site for every program within a 6-year cycle. 3 to 5 years actually is our approval. The 6-year cycle is a federal requirement. So we do have some of our approved privates are approved for 3 years. Some have a 1-year conditional approval and others have a 5-year approval. So from the program side of things on our side, we coordinate with the Office of Internal Audit to ensure that they're not reviewing the same programs that we're reviewing. So in a typical year, we could be on site in 17 to 20 of the 88 programs, as far
Okay.
as the comprehensive approval process, different than their auditing of their
Does
budgets.
does your process, that's actually very helpful.
Yeah.
So does your process include some of the similar things that would be included in a regular audit specific to finances?
There is some overlap in what we asked the programs to do, and they were very vocal about that with us to make sure that we're coordinating so they're not duplicating efforts. So there are some overlap, but we're on site looking at their facilities. We're interviewing staff, we're interviewing administrators, and our reports have kind of a different flavor, if you will. They're very much looking at what you mentioned, like here are the dollars that are going in. Are those students receiving the services that the district's paying for? And are they following the legally required components of the whole fiscal process?
Okay,
So
so
there is
you're-
some overlap, but not,
Right.
it's not the same type of audit.
Right. So does yours include, when your agency reviews,
Yeah.
does it include finances and how they're spending or looking at their budgets?
There is a provision where they're submitting their budgets to us on an annual basis, but that's not part of our approval, if that makes sense.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're
I'll
welcome.
ask my other questions later.
Thank you. And we have a representative.
Thank you. I had two questions on the evaluation we were just talking about was basically accrediting the programs and checking their books essentially. But what is the evaluation process like to figure out whether the programs are effective? One thing I'm struggling with is, we have these different groups providing services. We have in-district, we have RESCs, and we have private providers approved and private providers not approved. But who's doing the best job with the kids? Like, who's bringing the kids the farthest? Who has the most success stories of those groups? And is there a metric by which we can figure that out? Because we would like to, at the end of this process, emphasize the ones that are doing the best job.
So the question is, how do we measure success for students with disabilities, and what metrics are we looking at to see is this successful for students? And that could be a variety of things for a variety of students. And I think we've talked about this before, and you've mentioned the individualization there. So to answer your first question about who's responsible, so the students planning and placement team was designed for that's the parent, the school district, those individuals that know the student the best, to be able to design a program that student needs, location and placement aside. So we always say in the field, special education is not a program. It's individualized services for a kid. So who can provide those services most successfully may be different for two students in the same program. In other words, one student may struggle I'll just use as an example, in a REST program, and another might flourish based on their individual needs. But we do have metrics that we look at around achievement, attendance. We have a variety of data, but that planning and placement team that meets at least annually is receiving quarterly progress updates from that program. And if the student's not making satisfactory progress, there should be some changes and adjustments along the way, so that it's not, at the end of the year, the student hasn't been successful and you've lost a year. So those progress reports are required by law, and the planning and placement teams are reviewing those individual data to say, this is successful or not for this particular student.
Okay, so it sounds like there's really, there's no aggregated way to measure that. It's really individual. I keep asking the same question, so I'm starting to catch on that it's so individualized that it's very difficult to get those aggregated numbers. Like RESCs are at 87% performance, private providers are at 90. It's very hard to figure out which one is doing the best against its students' IEPs.
One of the so we do have aggregate data for achievement, and we report to the federal government on an annual basis for all students with IEPs in grades 3, 8, and 11 in math and ELA that are taking the Smarter Balanced assessment, their participation rates, their achievement rates, the gap between their achievement as well as non-disabled peers. And then for the Connecticut alternate assessment, we're also looking at proficiency rates with Connecticut. So we do have that aggregate. Now, the student belongs to the town of residence, so they're reported within that particular district. One of the challenges is that many of these programs, students are transient, so they may not be in a program for an entire year. They may enter mid-year, right before the achievement tests and so forth. So that population is always changing and shifting in a sense, but there are ways at the aggregate level that we could at least look at and trace back to some of the questions that you're asking for.
So one is the alternative statewide standardized assessments.
Yes.
And the other, what was the first one that you mentioned?
The Smarter Balanced assessment participation rates. So students, the goal is for 95% or higher for participation rates. So we do report on those data. And then we are also looking at proficiency on the standard assessment for each of those grade levels for ELA and math. So which, if a student has an IEP, are they meeting above basic? So are they achieving those standards? That's the measure. And then the gap between general education and special education.
Okay, thank you. I have one other question, which I know is shared by some of my colleagues, which is free and appropriate public education. Um, the appropriate part, a lot of these kids need services like mental health support, OT, PT, things that you could ask yourself, is that better handled through medical insurance or social services? Like, where does the line between what the school needs to support and what is outside the school, where is that line?
Yeah, if you think of it in a way of accessing education, that's the simplest way to put it. So if a student needs occupational therapy to be able to benefit from their general education program, then it's appropriate for the school to provide. If it's a medical-based model that working on other goals, that's really the separation. And that's for all of the related services a child would be recommended for or have related services in their IEP so that they can access their goals. So even though a student may have needs outside of education, that's really what the planning and placement team is focused on, if that helps.
So are there, through you, Madam Chair, so are there children who have an IEP and are excess cost grant kids, expensive and need a lot of services? Are some of those kids getting mental health services or PT or something that's not being paid for by the school?
Could be, yes.
Because it seems like a very blurry line. And, we
It's
can all
hard to
do-
explain to parents really and anyone really involved in the process. And it's, when you think about special education, you kind of jump to like a diagnosis. The school's not making diagnoses. They're determining a disability based on those three criteria I said before, like accessing the education, having an adverse impact on education. Because a lack of performance could be a variety of reasons. But really, the team is focused on, is this disability the reason why this child is not accessing or making those gains? And it could be, so for example, a lack of continuity of education. If a student was so transient that they missed first grade, second grade, and come into third grade, that's not a special education issue. That means they haven't received proper education and they're not able to read. So those are things that the team, through an evaluation, would be able to tease out and explain to parents.
Okay.
Another thing could be like temporary stressors in a student's life could really impact their progress, but that may not be a disability. We do have emotional disability as a category if it is for a marked amount of time over a certain time period and requires specially designed instruction to address. But it gets blurred. You're right. There
Yes,
is
it's blurred.
confusion around it.
Do we define FAPE more liberally than other states? Are we adhering? I've heard early on in this process, there's a federal standard, and then Connecticut goes farther than the federal standard. On this particular question, are we way out ahead of other states and how broadly we define a free and appropriate public education? Or are we kind of at the midpoint, or
Yeah.
hard
So
to say?
FAPE really means what is in the IEP. So, I mean, that's kind of what it is. So what is appropriate for that student is what that team designs and decides. So it's hard to measure from state to state around that.
Right.
There's folks are always asking in the eligibility process for more like specific information as to criteria for being eligible versus maybe not being eligible, but the student has a disability and may need some accommodations, for example. So it's a it's a legal term that is, it's a term of art, if you will. But I wouldn't say Connecticut more liberally applies the definition of FAPE
Okay,
necessarily.
thank you.
I just wanted to follow up just on one thing. So I know when we talked about the comparison of, I guess, like data on performance, whether we're using the alternative assessment or the regular assessment for students. And I know we love to see data. Like, I'm also a data person. I know we love to see it, but the question of looking at, let's just say, even if you compared school by school, the needs are so different within special education, right? And so you have students that receive special education that have an intellectual disability where their cognitive functioning is impaired, and you have students that receive special education for a behavioral disability where the cognitive function may or may not be impaired, but does not have to be. And so if we just look at, let's just say, school by school comparison, it's unfair to not take into account the disability, right? Because there's going to be different levels of performance, obviously based on individual need of that child. So I just want to put that for folks, especially if we receive data school by school, that it will be different because of disability type. And usually some of these private providers are not necessarily have students of one category, but sometimes they do have a theme of what they provide. And so they may have a program for students with autism, and they may have a program for just students with behavioral need or students that have lower functioning. So I just want to just put that out there, just the danger almost of comparing data just blanket off of performance without taking those other measures into account. And again, I love data, and I would love each of these schools to perform at their absolute best to make every single student, regardless of disability, work up to their full potential. But I think we just want to make sure we have those things in mind. So if you do have any data that you give us, if there's a breakdown of even like disability, it would be very helpful rather than just a blanket per school, because I think that would be alarming. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Yeah. So our Vice Chair, Representative Pools.
Hi, thank you for being here today. Does the CSDE have data from districts of students who are in specialized programs but do not meet the 4.5 times threshold? Do they submit all data for all their students, or only the ones that exceed the 4.5 times threshold?
Are you asking for cost data, or are you asking?
Cost data, yeah.
I believe that what we get through the excess cost request is pretty much the students who are exceeding or
Okay.
close to exceeding the 4.5.
So
not like individual
Yeah.
costs for students who are below that threshold.
is there any way, I guess as a follow-up, is there any way that the CSDA would be able to estimate what the cost would be if the threshold were lower for in-district programs for districts servicing the students in district? And the reason why I ask is that's a kind of an unknown. Is there any way to calculate what that would be?
Brian and I actually discussed this a little while ago. I don't know if we have the data to actually even estimate that. We may have to try to collect data that we don't have to try to get to be able to answer that question. Such that what would the cost? If you lowered it, what would it be? Because there would be additional students potentially could be submitted that we don't know right now.
I'm not a math guy, but the good chair is. But is there a way of calculating estimates based on a smaller sample size than the actual number of students? So to kind of survey and then be able to come up and say approximately this is what this would be based on.
That's kind of what actually we talked about, is how can we do some kind of sampling to try to get something like that, but we haven't. It's not become a formal ask as of yet. So,
thank you.
Thank you, Representative Nylander.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for all of this information. I think every time I hear something else, I'm like, I have another question I want to ask. So I'll try to stay on the same theme of what our good Vice Chair just asked. Or maybe, and this will just sort of be a comment, because if we are seeing an increase in reporting of students needing special supports, but the excess cost requests have stayed relatively level, then that means there is a bigger ask on our school districts that is not represented in the costs that are coming back to them. So I think that's something that we really do need to think about, is if we have families that are going to certain schools because they have such a great program and they're getting great supports and succeeding as students because of extra supports, but they aren't meeting that higher threshold, that's still part of still sort of part of FAPE, but how can we, financially support all of these schools? So the questions I had, based on this is sort of a curiosity question. Has your tracking mechanism changed at all over the years? You know, like the 11.5% to the 17 something percent now. Did how you quantified things change in that time? No?
No,
Okay.
the prevalence rates.
Okay, thank you. And can you explain, and I know that this is not something, I think you said it came from the State Board of Education, the approval process for the programs and things. How are non-approved private programs being allowed to take on students and receive public state education dollars?
So you're asking about programs. So for example, a non-approved school, a private school in our state that may be meeting the needs of an IEP or a student.
I suppose, but if they're not approved, how do we know that they are meeting those standards?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that students are in those types of placements. So if you're in a non-approved, there is no excess cost reimbursement that the district can access. So that's one provision there. A student could be placed in a setting like you're describing by their parent, because the parent feels as though the school district, the public school, is not meeting their needs. And then they may file for a due process hearing where a neutral entity, the hearing officer, would determine if that student can receive FAPE in that setting. So there's a process involved with that if the parent is asking for reimbursement. If the parent's placing a student there unilaterally and disenrolling from the public schools, they also have the right to do that on their own expense. So those are the kind of scenarios that would lead to a student being placed in those settings.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Madam Chair, I feel like we should have a longer conversation about that just
Sure.
to make sure. Again, my last comment was sort of ties to that again, is that for-profit entities should not be getting state public education dollars. And so I'll be looking for some of the information about how the State Board of Education approves these programs, and seeing how, I'm as a taxpayer, and I'm very protective of, and a legislator, I'm very protective of public education dollars and taxpayer dollars. And I think it should be a clearer process on how this funding is getting to certain places. So thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for those answers.
Yeah, I have one follow-up on that, and then Representative Condas as well. So can you explain that again? One, I want to echo those concerns. So one, just to clarify, our sort of public tax dollars are going to approved private programs that are for profit.
Yes.
Okay. And was there ever a discussion, or is the justification for that the approved not-for-profit programs weren't able to meet the special needs of those placements? Like why are we putting those dollars
that
there?
could be a scenario. Yes. So if there are programs that are comparable, when the district and the parent are looking at a placement that's appropriate for their student, they've designed the IEP, they know what the child needs. When they're looking at placements, if they have two comparable placements, the district could place in a location that is less costly than another, as long as they're able to implement that IEP. So it really comes back to that team to be able to make that determination of the appropriateness of the placement for the student.
So this is where I guess I come back to that oversight question then too, because so now we could be using those dollars in a for-profit institution that may perhaps at some point be charging more than other institutions, and that's entirely up to the school district to decide, but that money would then follow the student?
So the for-profit kicks in with the excess cost reimbursement. So around the requirements that there need to be approved. We have, of the 88 programs, we have 23, I believe, that are for-profit entities, and the remainder are non-for-profit. But basically, from the special education perspective, can they meet the needs of that IEP?
And if there were like two
Mhm.
equivalent programs, is there any
Exactly.
process that says we prefer the nonprofit program versus the for-profit program?
Not within the context of the special education process and the requirements around that process.
Okay.
So
This
it's
may come up again with the government oversight committee,
Sure.
but this question of how do these programs get approved maybe is a longer conversation, but it's one that I'm certainly also interested in,
absolutely.
especially how did the for-profit programs get approved when there were already existing nonprofit programs?
Mhm.
Right. And then the other question, if you can just clarify when you said, so for a non-approved program, somebody can, through a due process hearing, redirect state funds to that program, even though it's not approved?
Oops. Sorry, I was looking over to our due process lead, Kirsten Dovenberg, if you have questions about the due process, about that process, but the answer is yes, that could be an outcome.
Even though the program's not approved at all by the state. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So it's great because all of my questions tie with everybody. So I'm just gonna like piggyback on as the topics come up. So thank you guys for bringing that up. So just to follow up on that conversation. So one of the things that I think is a concern to me, some of these non-approved programs that through due process, a parent could unilaterally place a student and the district could ask for reimbursement, do not have to be special education schools at all. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. So it could be a private school, just,
Mhm.
regular private school that does not have special education, that does not technically do like IEPs.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And a
There's
school
different
district
scenarios,
would
but that
be
is a
able to,
possible
right,
scenario, yeah.
right. And I know it's only if the parent places, the district cannot place. Is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. So but in cases when a parent does place a child in a private school that does not provide special education, and this is for a child with special needs, a district could request excess cost dollars, excess cost reimbursement.
No. So you wanna-
Not for a non-approved facility, right? So,
Yeah, so I'm talking about,
sense.
so we're talking about when a district is like a student that is unilaterally placed by the parent. Parent took child out from their district and they put them at a private school that's a non-special ed school, okay? A regular private school. And the parent is asking for the district to pay the cost of educating their child because the district was not able to meet the needs, okay? So if the child then is determined to be placed there because whatever, the parent placed them, can the district apply for excess cost reimbursement?
Yeah. So not if it's a non-approved facility. They wouldn't be able to. So
So
we have parameters around the excess cost reimbursement.
Yep.
I think we shared recently that kind of there are different scenarios where excess costs could be accessed. And that's if the hearing officer determines that FAPE is being provided. In the scenario you described where no special education is happening, then excess costs would not be a possibility there.
Right, so as per that sheet, as per the guidance that we use to determine that, I think there is a way within that sheet, and I don't have it pulled up right now, but I think there is a way, or at least it seems, that if it is determined that that child's needs are met, even technically, even if they're not a special education provider, that would be reimbursed for excess costs, whether it's made at due process or if it's a determination that the school has made one-on-one with the parent.
Yeah, there needs to be an IEP in that scenario that's being implemented, and the district has to be involved in annual reviews and progress, typically, if that is the case, if they are in a program like you're describing, to be able to access the excess costs. I think we spoke about there's also settlement agreements that happen outside of the planning and placement team process, which is a different scenario.
Right. And I think, my bigger question is really like there's two different concerns here. One, there's a concern of somebody's still going to, like, the district could still be on the hook, whether they're not getting excess cost reimbursement or not. And again, these are still the district's dollars that they're using, which are still public dollars, to a non-special education school. And the district may, as per due process, like if it's determined that that's a fair placement, the district could be paying still for a child to go to a private school that's a non-special education school. Right? And I think I just need a little bit more clarity if we can figure out what that is for, especially excess cost, because at least our job is to protect state dollars. The district's job is to protect their own, but then our job is to also make sure that districts are protected against, because there's just one pot, right? There's one pot of money, whatever the district is. And so even if the district is on the hook and we're not paying, they're paying it out of their ECS dollars. They're still paying it out of something, right? They're paying it in some way. And so that is a concern, I think, and I think a lot of members on the committee do share that concern. Obviously, you guys didn't put that into place, so it's not like, it's a concern for you, but it's a concern. So we would love any data to support or any information just that you can give to support that. Just because, especially when I think of excess cost dollars, we're looking at our amount of excess cost dollars going up, and when we're looking at our reports, it's just a blanket number, right? We don't see exactly where that need is increased from or has not increased from. And so if there is, whether they're special education schools or not, if there's a way to also see where have rates gone up in all schools, or has it been, for example, just the for-profit schools that have rates have gone up, or it's the nonprofit schools that the rates have gone up, right? I think that's important to see. So a breakdown of kind of, if you do have that kind of information, would be very helpful to see where rates are going up. And then this other clarity on really excess cost dollars and how they can be used, or if and when in cases they can be used to for a non-approved school. That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe how many times that has happened, if you could just add that to the data as well. And Representative Rader. And then after that, we've Representative
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. And I am going to dovetail off of your dovetail because this is really important. And this is something I ran into with our Board of Ed, which I'm still on, is we had an outplacement that we felt was appropriate for the student, but the program hadn't been approved yet. And so it was kind of in process. And at the time, and we fixed this legislatively last session, was that districts would only get reimbursed once that program was approved. So you couldn't retroactively go back and reimburse the district, but because I experienced it, went to the chairs and we were able to legislatively get that fixed. So now if you guys are in process of approving an outplacement location that has yet to be approved, the district gets retroactively reimbursed. But this goes to my bigger question is, you talked about the audits of programs. There's about 6 to 8 a year. And that includes new programs, I'm assuming. Like, it's not. So nothing in there is the new, this is just existing approved programs.
So the State Department of Ed, we audit roughly 14 to 20 programs per year, including new programs.
Okay.
So if someone is looking for a new application,
Right.
the 6 to 8, I was referring to the Office of Internal Audit. That's a separate.
Right.
Yeah.
Got that. So what is the typical time frame for an approval process for a program?
So it could vary, but it's usually about a 3-month process
Okay.
from start to finish, from receiving the application, receiving that information. We're on site 2 days in the district with a team that goes in that are performing a variety of information. We take all that data back. We write a preliminary evaluation findings report. We submit that back to the program. They review it. If they agree to what we have to say and make their corrective actions, then a recommendation is made to the commissioner for approval. And there's a final report that comes out that's posted for that.
Okay.
But you were speaking to the newer programs, which
Yeah.
part of to become a standard approved private program, you have to be in existence for at least 1 year before you can be approved. And so
But only a year.
Yes.
Okay. And then, so once a program is approved, then then it gets put into that bucket of being audited, however that cycle then presents itself.
Yes, 1
Okay.
year, 3 years, or 5
Right.
years, depending on how that initial audit
Okay.
went. If you're a new program, you're automatically reviewed 1 year later.
Okay.
And then from there, it could be up to 3 to 5 years.
Okay, and then my last kind of roundabout question for all, well, not roundabout, but the kind of the point of this question is, when we talk about these unapproved outplacement locations, is it because they've gone through the process and have been rejected? Or is it a combination of some that just don't bother to get approval? Or there's been some that have sought approval and have been rejected? Like, and do we have that information to know? Like, a district is like, we're going to put this child at school B. Well, a year ago, that school applied to be approved and they were rejected. So I'm just curious, do you keep that information or does that happen? Does that play out very often?
All the different scenarios you described could happen. Within the last several years that I've been at the department, there hasn't been a scenario where a school applied, didn't receive approval, and then existed as a non-approved that I'm aware of.
Okay.
So those are, I'm not saying it's never happened, but at least in my
Yeah.
tenure here, I don't recall a situation that would be that scenario. But we have had programs before that were approved. They notify us and said, we're no longer interested in being approved. They let their district, there's a process for that. They let the districts know, and they exist on their own outside of the approval process.
Interesting. Okay, and what happens to students that have already been placed there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the
Okay.
biggest question. That's our biggest concern in those scenarios. We've had programs that have shut down, and again, there's a process where that approved private special education program is working with the school district to find a comparable placement. But as we know that there are few and far between, the approved privates are going through the same things school districts are with staffing and capacity and so forth. So hopefully there's the least amount of impact as possible. Our processes call for notification in far enough in advance during those scenarios, but those districts who may have received excess costs this year may be notified that next year they're not going through the approval process, and so that could be an additional cost burden on the district unless the students place in an alternative
Right.
program.
And then my last question is just in terms of your auditing, do you feel you have the appropriate staffing and kind of bandwidth to manage this? I mean, it's an honest question because do you feel that you have the staff you need to be properly monitoring these programs in these schools?
So we are able, the way that the standards are in place now and the process that we have been able to maintain the requirements. Additional staff would always help, given the number of programs that we have. Last year, the legislature in Public Act 23-137 did include additional staff for the Bureau of Education, which we are really appreciative of. So we have 2 new ed specialists. One of those new ed specialists that has come on board is assisting our person who was involved with approved privates previously. So very recently, our capacity has expanded. But anyway, I'll leave it
Right,
at that.
the magic wand, we can't always, yeah. Okay, no, but that's important to know.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Madam Chair.
I just got a quick follow up, and I know Representative Zupkis is after that. On the unapproved, I'm just more concerned about this due process, the process by which I guess unilaterally a decision can be made to then transfer state dollars to an unapproved program. How does that decision get made during that is that because there's no approved program that can meet the needs of the student at that time? Is there anybody from the state that's involved in that process before an unapproved program is then able to get, or you're able to get reimbursement for placing student in an unapproved program?
Well, good afternoon. First, I'm Kirsten Dovenberg. I am the lead for the due process unit. And so I'll speak to that. When a student is in a due process hearing and a hearing officer hears it has a fully adjudicated hearing, they can ultimately make a determination that the parent's placement, their unilateral choice, is going to be is appropriate and can direct the district to pay for that placement. And in that situation, it could be an unapproved school. Okay, so it's called a three-prong test that's been established by the Supreme Court. Burlington, Carter are the two cases that establish a three-prong test. The first prong of the test is that they have to demonstrate FAPE was not provided to the student. Okay, so if the district did not provide FAPE in the IEP that was in the district. It then shifts, the second prong has to be that the parents need to demonstrate that their private placement is appropriate. Now that standard for that private placement is a much lower standard than what we have for our approved schools. It doesn't have to be, as somebody had mentioned, I can't remember, forgive me, but it does not have to be an approved school. It doesn't even have to be a special education school. So long as they can demonstrate that that school is appropriate with this lower standard to meet the needs. And the third prong is the equities. They have to demonstrate that at no point in time did the parents prohibit the district from providing FAPE. And so in that situation, if a hearing officer orders in their decision that the district must pay for the parent's placement, yes, then funding can go to a non-approved school.
So in the situation where a district was ready to place the student in a approved program, and the parents said no, that would go within that equity question. That may still not be a sort of appropriate transfer.
Well, it would have to first, again, that goes back to that first prong. If they're in the hearing, then the district can say, we had an appropriate program. This was FAPE, this was appropriate. And if the hearing officer agrees, then they'll say, okay, we don't even need to look at the parent's unilateral placement. We don't need to look at the equities. We think that the district provided FAPE. And we've met that first prong of the scenario.
Okay. Well, let's say the district didn't provide it, but they have an alternative where they can potentially outplace, let's say. Can they say we have a approved alternative? Just how much discretion does the district have at that moment? It seems like there's an ability really to kind of unilaterally redirect to. Is that the case?
That's a great question, but once they're in a hearing, they're questioning that particular IEP. It's the IEP that was written. And so there's a due process hearing request that challenges that IEP that says this IEP that was written did not provide my child with FAPE.
Okay.
And so the district can definitely argue, no, look, we recommended this program and it could be an outplacement that was approved. But if the hearing officer, based on all the evidence that was presented and the testimony that the hearing officer heard, determines that no, in fact, that school district did not provide FAPE in that IEP, then they can order a different placement.
Okay, because it's a due process violation.
Exactly.
So how many times does that happen, would you say? What's the sort of frequency of that kind of scenario?
It really depends. Right now, for example, for our current school year, for the 23-24, so I'll take that school year, that's what most of the hearings coming through, we only have 4 fully adjudicated hearings. And so, and 2 of those they're for evaluations, they're not for outplacement. There are 2, however, in which that did occur. And so it does happen. It depends year to year. And it just depends on what cases come forward, but it does happen and hearing officers do order that.
Thank you. Representatives up. Sorry.
Sorry, just real quick on what you just said. The hearings that we do have, would you say like more are for these specific cases? And I know some are evaluations, so we can separate that. But I mean, in specifically versus parents that go there to just request a approved just special education program versus unilateral. I'm just trying to see like what are the majority of the cases that are coming before us consisting of?
It really depends. It
Okay.
really depends year to year. We have a lot of filings. So for example, we have 350 due process hearing requests on average a year. And that has been an increase by 50% over the past 4 years. So we're seeing a trend of more and more of those coming forward. However, we don't have that many fully adjudicated cases. And I can't give you a reason exactly as to why that is, but a hearing is a long, onerous process, and you are asking then a third party, your hearing officer, to make an ultimate determination. So sometimes those those hearing requests are resolved in a mediation or in another type of resolution session is another piece that can happen where you can come to back together, or even at a PPT, and they resolve that, and so they don't come all the way to the end of the hearing. The ones that we do have, it depends year to year again, and it depends on who's involved. Sometimes it is about services that took place or lack thereof. We definitely saw some of that immediately following COVID. And so that could be an issue. Unilateral placements are certainly something that's there. We do see a lot of evaluations that come forward. So it depends on the year.
Okay. And thank you for sharing that data point. I think that's kind of interesting. The 50% increase you said in over the last how many years?
4 years.
4 years, in requests for due process. Okay. Yeah. I think if any information that we could get on what those may or may not consist of would be helpful, because that seems to be a big increase. And if there's a specific, scenario that's coming up a lot more, I'd love to see that. And I know that we're kind of leaning into that conversation around burden proof. And I do have some questions, but I want to allow Representative Zepkis, who's been so patient. So,
Thank you. You just took the words out of my mouth, burden of proof. Because it seems to me it was changed a few years ago from where it was burden of proof on the parents that they had to prove that their child needed to go to this other school or somewhere. And honestly, as a parent, I work with a lot of parents that have some severely disabled children. They want the best for their parent as I want the best for, their child as I want the best for my child. So, right or wrong, I can understand that. And now that the burden of proof was shifted a few years ago, that now the school has to give the burden of proof. And so I think that has something to do with it. Would you agree?
So this is an interesting discussion, and if you'll give me a couple of minutes or not minutes, a couple seconds to explain the burden of proof and the shift that took place in the legislation that was passed in July of 2023. So in the language, it shifted the order of operation of who was presenting first at the hearing. Previously, the school district presented first, and they would have to put on their case in chief initially, and then the parent would follow. What happened in the legislation is that shifted who was presenting first. And so now it's the board that goes first. It's not the parent. Excuse me if I said that incorrectly. The parent used to go first. Now it is the board. The burden of proof has not changed. The burden of proof has always been on the district for matters of FAPE. What has shifted is, and I think the exact language in the legislation is that the board will now present first operationally. So now, does that shift things? Yes. And from what I understand, part of the intent was that it's very difficult for parents, especially unrepresented parents, to be able to have all of the information the district has at their disposal. So from my understanding from my colleagues is that was the initial intent, to make this an easier process to gather information for the unrepresented parent. But the burden of proof has always been on the district in matters of FAPE. Do I think that has created a shift in your question was, is that becoming more challenging for the districts? I think it was change, and it was certainly something that was an adjustment. I see adjustments happening right now, and they're learning to deal with this. Change is always a slow process. I think there was a lot of concern when that initially happened, because understanding what you're putting on for your case is difficult if those specific issues are not really clearly defined. And so if it's a broad question of what you're presenting at hearing, that's hard to know exactly what to put on. And I do think the district struggled with that. And so narrowing those issues, and our hearing officers have been doing that, I think has made a big change. And we've gotten some positive feedback about that.
Thank you. That wasn't one of my questions. That just came up by the way.
Representative Zupkis, can I just follow up on that though?
Yes.
Just with that preliminary. So you just said that my question was, is there some kind of preliminary hearing where the districts can at least understand? Because that was one of the things we heard from a number of superintendents, is that we have no idea what claims are actually the sort of the source of the problem, and so we're presenting everything very broadly. But with this sort of preliminary hearing, I would imagine some of that can happen in a preliminary process before you have the due process hearing. So is that a recent change that has been happening more often? So school districts feel like they have a sense of why parents are, requesting the due process hearing in the first place?
And that's a great question, and it is in two different places. So the first, there is in our state regulations, there is a requirement that there is a telephonic pre-hearing conference. So everybody must participate in a pre-hearing conference before the hearing. At that pre-hearing conference, it's actually also outlined that the issues need to be defined and clarified. And so that is an opportunity at which point for the parties to come in and ask, what exactly are you looking for? What is the nature of the concern? Because as we mentioned, if it's too broad, it's difficult to know what you need to present or how to put on a case in chief. So they are required to do that. And if people do not participate, the hearing officer can dismiss the case. And so you are required to attend the pre-hearing conference. In addition to that, we have, once a due process hearing is requested, there is a 30-day period of time, which is called the resolution session period. During that 30-day period of time, within 15 days of the filing of your due process hearing, the school district and the parent come together to try to resolve whatever took place. It was set up, it's actually a federal law, it was set up to provide that opportunity to cure or to fix whatever was there, with that exact question in mind of, well, if I don't know what's wrong, how can we fix it? And so they do have this option of a resolution session. It's very similar to a PPT. They're not the same required members to attend the resolution session, but that does need to happen within 15 days. The parties can agree to waive that and move immediately to hearing if they want. That pre-hearing conference cannot be waived, however. The parties can also agree to waive the resolution meeting in lieu of mediation. And we do see that happen quite a bit. They often like mediation because there's a third party that comes in and can help facilitate the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative Zepkis.
Thank you. And speaking of the IEP, I think that is something that needs to be looked at. We had these listening tours, as you know, and I spoke to a couple of parents at these. And for example, they would say, well, the IEP, and first of all, I've been through an IEP. I don't even know what is happening, right? So with most parents, how do you even know what questions to ask? Because you're so overwhelmed and confused by all the verbiage. And a couple of parents said to me, my child needs a full-time para, and wasn't provided one. And so is it, during the IEP process, the person presenting the IEP, I don't know what they're called, the teacher, whoever, the administrator says your child needs a para, but we don't have one. We can't afford one. They wouldn't say it necessarily that way, but we don't have one in our school. And so the school automatically has to go out and find one or do something. And so I guess I'm just curious, and maybe it's a comment more than a question. Does the IEP disregards any money, anything, except for this is what this child needs. This is what your kids needs. Now, district, go figure it out somehow. And not saying that children should not get what they need. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying maybe communication needs to be better. I've heard IEPs used to be 1 page. Now they're like 30 pages, or it takes teachers and administrators forever to fill them out. So personally, I think the IEP process, which I don't know a lot about, should be looked at. You look like you want to say something.
Just want to say, yes, that is correct. It's based on the needs of the child. Finances can't be a reason why a student doesn't receive something that they're required. Now, there could be a debate or a question, hopefully based on data, whether or not the child needs a paraeducator. The district could say that the student's accessing their education appropriately, or we're going to collect some more data on that. So those could be discussions that are had in a PPT meeting. but it is not a financial consideration.
Right. And I don't know that it should be a financial.
Yeah.
But if the schools can, I mean, we have a para shortage. We can't find people that are paras. We have teacher shortages. We
Right.
have all these things, but yet your child has to have this. Okay, go figure it out. And so I
Yeah,
don't know. I just
it's-
think there needs to be some.
There's no question that the staffing, crises, the vacancies in place impact the delivery of services. No question about it, and that's many of our cases that do rise to the level of hearings or complaints are based on lack of provision of services. As far as the IEP itself, the IEP took an initiative where the IEP in place back in before 2021. We do have a new IEP in place that was designed based on stakeholder feedback and was redesigned very recently. And so it's a new, again, we were talking about change before, so it is a new process-based system versus filling out a form. But it's always good feedback to hear, and we're always looking for ways to continuously improve. As far as parents understanding the process, the district plays a role, obviously, in helping a parent understand. And we also have a parent and training information center in our state called CPAC that have a variety of resources to help parents prepare before, during, and after a meeting to help navigate, because it's a very complex process, no question about it.
I never heard that. And so
Yeah.
as a parent that went through it, I would have no idea how to do that. I
Yeah.
was just in there on fighting for my child.
Yeah.
Right. And then my last question. So talking about oversight of approved facilities, outplacement facilities. So if I look at the RESC, the nonprofits, the for-profits that are approved, do they all have the same oversight? I have been told that RESC do not. So I just wanted to clarify, and it's nothing, I'm not here to beat up RESC, but I was told that they don't have the same oversight or fee structure that other places do.
So the fee structure is developed by the RESCs, and our standard approval process that the state board that I mentioned approved that document, and those standards apply only to approved private special education programs. So the RESCs, we do have oversight over the RESCs as far as provision of services, training, making sure that the students are receiving what they need to, but we don't approve those programs. The RESCs are an extension of a district, so there's a contract, again, between that local district and the RESC to build a program, to access a program that's already existing, all of those things happening at the local level. So it is different. Our role is different with the regional education programs. But one of the new provisions that came out of that same legislation I mentioned earlier are that the state do unannounced random on-site visits, and both the approved private special education programs and the RESC programs are involved in that process, as well as our public schools.
Involved that you go and do
On
that
site.
to them?
Yes.
Or they do that?
We do that. We go on site, random,
Right.
unannounced, observing our IEP, provisions of IEP. We interview parents of students that attend those programs to identify any concerns, questions. We acknowledge the positive aspects of the program that are in place. And then if we see any areas of non-compliance, we're required to make sure that the program knows what those areas are and that they're addressed and fixed. So all of those programs fall under that monitoring requirement. We're just not approving them if that is.
Okay, but otherwise they operate just like any other approved outplacement.
For their
and they do
requirements.
have-
They have the same requirements.
Thank you. And then just my last question. I was talking to one of the outplacement facilities. It's a nonprofit, and of course, they're very concerned about this, obviously. But one of the suggestions or something they told me was that their professional development, they have to have professional development, just like all these other outplacement or all these other nonprofits and school districts. But being a school district, it is covered, but for outplacements, they have to pay absorbent amount of money kind of for the same professional development that somebody would get in a school district. So I was just curious about that.
So it depends. They do have access to professional development and training, but when we put stipends in place or are following through, I'll use the para educator training as an example. The $1.8 million that from the state budget that was earmarked for professional development and training were for local education programs. I believe we also expanded that to the guest programs, charters and magnets and so forth. Right. It wasn't only the LEA districts, but for example, the approved private special education programs weren't able to access those dollars. So in that context, they're not able to access depending on how those earmarks are made. With IDEA funds, we are those are funds for the LEAs. And so sometimes there's parameters around the training and information there where they're unable to access it. Having said that, we do offer trainings to the APSEPs and work with them as far as what their needs are. We meet on a regular basis with CAPSEF, which is their professional organization, similar to CONCASE. But there are initiatives, I guess you could say, or specific earmarks that they wouldn't be able to access, whereas only the LEAs could. So that's a cost for the APSEP.
Right, that puts into the tuition that we pay for.
That could, yeah, right. I mean, they
Right,
have
the
to,
cost.
right. Yes,
Thank you.
you're welcome.
Representative Khan has a follow-up, and then Representative Santiago.
All right. Again, perfect segue because you asked some of the questions that I had originally written down. So one thing I think I heard you catch, I just want to clarify. You said that for the risks that have like private centers, private school, or private special education programs, they set their own rates. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And I know, I mean, technically up until now, we haven't, I don't know if we've explored, but we don't have rate setting that is state mandated. And that is something we're looking at now. Just a comment based on that, like right now, up until now, everybody has technically set their own rate, right? The private providers, the rest, anyone, the for-profit, nonprofit, everyone has set their own rates. And whether that's based equitably on what they're actually spending on the student and what the needs are, we don't know. And I think it would be a different story based on different places. However, as we explore rate setting and as we look at what is an equitable way to kind of set those rates, I think there are rather than just like a blanket, you can't charge more than this. I think we need to look at making sure they're based on what the student is receiving as per their IEP. And so more services would naturally mean more money, right, for that particular child. However, depending on the type of program it is and whether they have a base amount that we already fund, that rate would be different. So for example, if we just said, hey, you can't charge more than $150 an hour for speech, at a private special education program that does not have base pay that they receive from the state, though that rate should look different than what it would at a RESC that already receives base pay. Or an open choice program that already receives base pay. And I bring this up, and this is more just guidance because of just what I'm seeing. So I have the honor of representing the capital city of Hartford. And Hartford has a very unique school system, as you know, and we have all of the providers, all different school providers that have Hartford students that attend their programs. Open choice, magnets, charters, and then private approved programs. Any student that lives in Hartford that goes to any of these programs, the program they go to can bill them for special education. And right now, we don't have guidance that says what they can and cannot bill for when they're, or what they can bill for, but there's no rate guidance on how much they can charge for a specific service. Am I correct? You can correct me if I say anything incorrect as I keep going.
It's actual costs. So it's reasonable in the language. So it's if a student's in a charter school, they have to demonstrate the actual costs and bill that back to the district.
Who do
based
they have
on
to
their
demonstrate that
staffing.
to?
I'm sorry?
Who do they have to demonstrate that to?
The district, the LEA, so the resident town has to pay for, they can't charge more than the actual cost for that particular student. And it's not easy. I mean, it sounds easier than it is, obviously. I'm just thinking about, for example, a co-taught classroom that's supporting 5 different students, so that, when you're looking at salary and things of that nature, there has to be a percentage devoted to that. Transportation's a lot easier because there's a fixed cost with transportation, and you can divide by 2 kids on a bus necessarily.
And I'm glad you spoke to co-taught. So I will tell you that just based on my own conversations with folks from other districts that are open choice, and for any committee member or the public that may not be familiar, open choice only is allowed for certain districts, and I don't know outside of Hartford which districts it is, but I think it's a lot of our cities that participate in that program, which basically allows for a student that lives, and I'll speak to Hartford, that lives in Hartford to be able to access education in a non-Hartford school. And there are certain schools that participate, not just any school. There's a specific list of schools that participate. So if they get in the open choice lottery, they attend that school. If the child has an IEP, the services can be billed to Hartford. That's the specific question I'm asking. I just want to clarify. So from personal accounts of people that oversee some of these programs within their own district. So now I'm talking about the district that has a student. So I think that's called the receiving district. What I've been told from receiving districts that they can bill whatever amount they feel is fair. Okay, as long as it somehow benefits or is servicing the Hartford student. And so my concern there is what I've been told from these receiving districts, that they often will bill for staff for special education to Hartford, that special education staff that they are also utilizing to help their students in the receiving districts. And technically, especially in a co-taught model, so let's say you have 3 students from Hartford in this specific class, but the rest of the class is whatever, receiving district is. And so you're billing Hartford for the special education staff that you are utilizing in your home district. And right now, there's no guidance, what I've been told, and this is again by the receiving district, that there is, people told me themselves that we bill for staff right now to Hartford that provides special education services to our students in our district. This is what I've been told directly from home districts. And so is there a protection in place that would prevent something like that from happening from receiving districts to charge whatever they want and to utilize those staff however they want? Obviously, within these programs, you can't say, that's a Hartford teacher, nobody can touch her, right? So obviously, I understand that there has to be some kind of way, but what I would assume is almost like an FTE, you wouldn't bill for a full-time FTE unless they were providing all of the services to X amount of students in Hartford. But just in terms of how is that determined, what is reasonable, because like I said, this is what's been told to me by receiving districts, that they do currently bill Hartford for special education staff that covers their students in receiving districts.
Yeah, so that's not legal to do that. There are provisions in the law where a receiving district cannot or should not be making any type of profit. So it's based on the actual cost, based on that student's IEP of what they need. So in those cases, there should be a percentage of time allocated. If there's I'll just use a one-on-one paraeducator as an example, because that's a clean example, but if there's a paraeducator working with that Hartford student, they could bill for the full cost of that paraeducator. If there's a classroom paraeducator that's working with Hartford students and other students, they should not bill for the full cost of that paraeducator. So there are provisions in the law, and the school district could contest or question those charges so that, so that there would be a discussion, negotiation, before those payments are made. But so folks come to us often if there are questions or concerns around the charges from the receiving districts. But if they're charging above and beyond what the actual cost is, then that's a big problem.
Right. And I say that to say, I know like technically there are probably, there's language that says,
Yeah.
it has to be the actual cost, but
Yeah.
to be able to demonstrate that, I think that's where the lines are now vague, right? And so this is why they're able to do what they're doing now. And the reason, and like I usually do not try to bring just my district into any state issue, but the reason this is obviously also on us is because the moment that that amount goes more than 4.5 times for Hartford, then Hartford is requesting obviously excess cost reimbursements, right? And so I think in a lot of these cases, somewhat that is happening. And I'll just tell you, just based on Hartford data, what I have, just because I want to make sure that we're looking at discrepancy. And this is again, my hope would be that when we're doing rate setting, that we're taking other providers into account, including open choice. The average that Hartford pays for, and this is just special ed tuition, not base amount, not other tuition, to students in magnet schools is 20,000, about 19 to $20,000 for special education services, and to open choice is 38,000 average. And this is on this public document on Harvard Public Schools. So when, and both magnet schools and open choice schools have their own base pay. They're not private, they have public documents. But for it to be almost double in open choice districts, and open choice districts have been wealthier districts that were able to provide, a good education system, which is why Harvard students were allowed to access that the education in those districts. But for it to be almost double of what a magnet school is doing, which again, even rate setting there, I think, their magnet schools have set their own rates, but now we have open choice that there is again no rate guidance, and the average is 40,000. And this is on top of what they would receive regularly for students, on top of what they receive for open choice grant. This is just special education. So I think that this is a very, this is, I don't want to say like a loophole, but I think that we need to really look at how and what looks like reasonable costs, and how is a receiving district that's saying this is what we're spending, demonstrating that that is going to this service, because that amount, just that discrepancy there, it doesn't seem to be, it shouldn't cost double the amount to provide and again, this is a large amount of students, so it's not like it's like 2 students that you could say that it was due to like maybe just specific need, but this is about 1,500 students, about 1,000 in magnet schools and about 500 in open choices for Hartford alone. But I think it's very important that we're looking at that guidance, because again, if and when those cases, because if the average is 40, I assume a lot of those may for Hartford hit that 4.5 times. And so that is, again, then a state like we are also funding. So as a state, while it's obviously it's a concern for me in my district, but I think also when we're looking at this and we're looking at rate setting, it's absolutely crucial that we look at each provider and look at what their needs should be and how they should demonstrate reasonable. And I fully understand that we're saying they have to demonstrate it to the district. But what we're asking is the district that has students in 20 different 20 different schools to be able to like verify the reasonable costs in each different school. And I just don't think that our districts have the staffing available to do that. And so I think that we need to have either more guidance or more guidelines for receiving districts to be able to prove that that is fair and reasonable. And again, why it's important that rate setting also address all the providers, including open choice. Okay. All right. I had Yeah, I know, there are questions. I had a question on burden, but I know you're still here as long as you're not leaving. I think you had
Representative Santiago.
Santiago.
Okay. So a lot of it, thank you, Representative Khan, because that was a long, so I was waiting for a question at the end. But are the rec schools or the rec districts treated different than other private providers like ACES and CREC? Are they being treated different
Could you?
as far as getting more funding?
So they set their own rates. So each of the regional education centers set their rates, whether they be tuition or rates for services that the districts can access in their catchment areas. And so the state's not involved in that rate setting process. But I was describing a little bit earlier, we're not approving those regional programs by the RESCs that are designed by the RESCs to support the district's needs, the same way that we are for the approved private special education programs. But our general supervision and monitoring for those students is the same, whether you attend a RESC program or an approved private, or if you're in public school or one of the choice programs.
So basically they can charge whatever they want.
Yes, they set their rates.
So can that be controlled like in a contract between the district school and the RESC? Bless you.
God bless. Yeah, so typically, so any student that's placed in an out-of-district placement, there's a contract that's required.
Right.
And so in that contract, there are several things that need to be in the contract, but one of the things that needs to be in the contract are the student's needs, which are the IEP services that that child needs to receive. And then the costs associated with that, the district signs that, agreement. And so it is a part of that. But the rate setting, that's what one of the proposals that we spoke about earlier were so that those costs could be transparently communicated prior to the budget cycle for the local education agencies so that they can plan and prepare for those costs.
Which is leading to what I'm bringing up is because
Yeah.
they can at any time increase their rates by adding another speech therapist or somebody else that is needed, not specifically for that IEP, but within the district. And then like in Meriden, those costs already gone up 14% because there is no capping of those rates when you're getting those services from the RESC schools. So that's why I'm looking at to see if that can be controlled by the contracts between the in-district school and the out-district school. Right? So that's a way to control it. If let's say we don't come up this session with any kind of cap setting for these rates for these RESC schools.
Right. So you're asking if the contract in place that the LEA has with the program, in this case, a regional education center, is set, meaning that they can't increase costs within the parameters of that contract. And that's what I was saying earlier. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know how that process works. I know that did occur this year where students were placed in a regional education setting and there was a mid-year increase. And so I don't know how that worked out within the context of a contract legally, but I do know that the services that are provided to the students really is where our department and our responsibility comes in, is that continuity of services remains. So if for example, if there's a need for a program to remain in existence where they need additional funds and additional dollars, if they don't receive those dollars, it impacts students' programming. So we were talking earlier about some programs may not be able to exist or have to close down their doors. Hopefully that doesn't happen mid-year if there's unexpected costs or things of that nature. But I would think if you have a contract with an entity that with a set amount, with a set time in the services that are being provided, then that should be a protection for the LEA.
But that's not what's happening. What's
Right.
happening is that, even though they have a contract and there's a cost that it's like mid-year, then then the LEA has to go scrambling to find the money to pay for that extra staffer or what the school might think that the child needs. But that could probably be controlled with either a contract or the IEP.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so if students' needs change mid-year, that would definitely impact the costs. If they require all of a sudden a one-to-one paraprofessional or some other services, the district, after their budget process, would have to determine or figure out how to provide those and whatever type of setting that student was in. So you're absolutely right in that the IEP would drive that and the contract with the entity who's implementing that IEP.
So do you have lawyers within the State Department of Ed that look at those contracts? Let's say there is a dispute that they don't want to provide the service with the rest school if the increase is set.
So we do look at contracts as part of our auditing process because they're required to be in place. So our auditors do review and look at the contracts. We also look at contracts within the context of excess cost reimbursement. But if there's a dispute, at least to my knowledge, I don't know that our legal department has been involved in facilitating that dispute. It would be between the local district and the entity.
Okay. I have one more question. So is the State Department of Ed setting aside resources to help the district develop high quality programs at any point?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. That's it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Belinsky, did you have a question that you wanted to? No. Representative Khan.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of go back a little bit on to burden of proof conversation. So I know we talked about the shift, not in the burden, but the shift in the order of which who speaks first, that was changed a couple of years ago. And you mentioned that the I guess not necessarily the reason for the change, but the advocates for the change had a particular concern about unrepresented parents. So do you know what would be, I guess, like how many of the cases that especially get referred to process, what percentage of those would be unrepresented parents versus represented parents?
I don't know as far as how many come through. I could get that for you out of that 350 that we typically see as a due process complaint. I don't have that readily available, but I can tell you regarding fully adjudicated cases. We are higher than a lot of different states. We tend to have about, I'd say that the fully adjudicated in the past 2 years ago, so the 22-23 school year, there were more pro se parents than represented parents that had a fully adjudicated hearing. Typically, it's about, out of the parents that prevail, about 50% are pro se parents. So there's a handful. I mean, I would say that we do have a lot that file, but a lot are settled before they become a fully adjudicated.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, if you have like further data on some of what that looks like, I think that would be helpful. And then you talked about a pre-hearing that's, I guess, on the phone. That's a required if anyone were to go to due process, that they would be required to attend this pre-hearing. What, especially in terms of what is the data or information at least that a district can receive about the case? Because I know we said they would receive some of what the complaint is. And I'm asking this question because the concern that I know I've received, and I think many of us have received from districts, is that they feel that they walk into some of these blind, like almost like blind, right? They have no idea what the issue is. And so if they did attend this, because I know in some cases you said they don't attend, but let's say if they did attend, what would they be presented with? What's the level of information?
So first, they are required to attend, and it's not usually an issue that the districts don't attend. So
Okay.
they are
right.
required to attend. Uh, Before a due process complaint can be processed, the hearing request, that it can be anywhere from 1 page on our state form to a 20, 30-page document, that has to be served on the district. So first and foremost, it's the timeline for a due process hearing begins the moment that is received by the opposing party. So the district gets the due process complaint. In that, they're required, there's a minimum pleading standard. So there's a sufficiency that needs to be in the complaint. That complaint has to list the issues that will be presented and then a proposed resolution. If that complaint does not have, if that due process hearing request, it's also called due process complaint, if it does not have those pieces in it, then the district can always say it's insufficient and ask for it to be dismissed. So assuming that it's sufficient and the district had the basic understanding what's there, at the pre-hearing conference, that's what it's about. It's defining issues and clarifying exactly what's taking place. So at that pre-hearing conference, the district and usually their attorney can have that conversation with the hearing officer and opposing party to define exactly what's going to be discussed at the hearing.
Okay, and would they have information on, would they be able to get also information kind of on like what um evidence at all that the other party has?
So there can be a general discussion of what would be required to present, but they do not have to, the opposing side does not need to present the district with their exhibits and what would they propose to be in evidence before 5 days before the start of the hearing. So it's called a 5-day disclosure rule. 5 days before the hearing begins, they have to give their entire evidence packet to the other side.
Oh, okay. All right. I didn't know that. That's helpful. All right. I'm trying to think of if I had other due process questions before I shift, because I don't want to keep going back and forth, but it'll come later, I'm sure. All right. Going back to the approval process for private special education programs. So when whether it's when you guys go in for the reapproval or even for an audit, if there are corrective actions that are recommended for the program, how are those handled? Like, what do they have a timeline of, when they have to make the corrections? And then what is the follow-up in making sure that those things actually happened?
Yeah, it definitely depends. The follow-up definitely depends on what the standard issues are. So each of the standards are laid out, and if there's a non-compliance or lack of adherence to any of those standards, we cite that in the report, and then the district reviews that. If they're if they agree with the report and the corrective actions, they let us know, and then we basically keep an spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet of the different areas of non-compliance, of the corrective actions that are required. It is time bound. So depending on the issue, I'll use, for example, like background checks as an issue. If we find that, we would ask for any new hire within the school year that they need to demonstrate that they have the background checks done, and that they would send us a list and documentation that all of their staff previously. And so each corrective action can look differently, but we collect that information from the district, often with a timeline attached to it. And then once those corrective actions are complete, then it's closed out.
Okay. Do you feel that, as per like what is current, I guess, process, do you feel
Yeah.
that it has been sufficient enough to, really make sure that those corrective actions occurred?
Yeah, for the corrective actions to occur initially, yes, I do. I think like any other process, we're always looking to improve. And so, there were concerns about in between, let's say a program's approved for 5 years. So if we're in that year, corrective actions happen, what about the following year? Like those same issues could arise again because we're not in there looking in the files. So we have what's called an annual attestation for the executive directors of those programs to sign off on all those required provisions. And what we're doing now, based on the recommendations of what came out in a previous report from the Office of Child Advocate and Disability Rights Connecticut, is that we're randomly selecting a number of those annual attestations to physically see what folks are signing off and attesting to have in place. So as far as the process goes, we're always looking at ways to improve and to continuously improve on that. And that's one example of in between those approval sites and visits on how we're keeping in contact and keeping in touch. Another really important provision is if there are any concerns in any of the programs that we hear either from parents through our call center, that we hear from the school districts, that we hear from any of our partner agencies, we can conduct what's called an off-cycle visit. And we can do that at any point in time. The commissioner has the authority to do that. Commissioner also has the authority to remove approval if there's a significant issue that takes place. So those parameters we engage in and we continue to implement, if you will.
Okay. All right. I mean, I think that especially, and I know you referenced the report
Yep.
from OCA and disability rights. I think there was some stuff in there that was particularly concerning regarding how, for me, especially on the I think the attestations that they can say that they have technically, you know, made the correction, but whether they made it or not is really, we are almost going on just good faith or trust.
So there's two things there, just to clarify. The attestation is different than the corrective action process. So if there is a citation and a corrective action process, we follow up and we need to see the documentation and have that evidence
Okay.
provided to us. We don't ask for that in an attestation because that's an approved.
Okay.
It's not related to any issues or corrective actions, and they're attesting that all these things are in place.
So when would when would the APSA provide an attestation?
On an annual basis over the summer, we
Okay.
collect those. And
Okay.
so we did or in the past had taken their word for that with the executive director's signature. Now we've ramped that up in a sense where we're randomly selecting a number of districts to say, okay, you signed off and attested that your background fingerprinting checks are, please send us. So
Mhm.
so the APSEPs know that we could ask at any point in time for that.
The ones that you're doing randomly, about how many can you do right now per year?
For the
Roughly.
random site within the context of,
Yeah.
yeah,
like-
that's a good question. I mean, with two individuals, we probably have the capacity to do almost the same number that we're doing during the year for our visits. So
Okay.
between 15 to 20.
Okay. Okay. Just because, you know, I think there is what's happening, what from just me looking at it is there are oversight in different, you know, capacities, I guess, right? But especially when we talked about like with 88 providers,
Yes.
between 88 providers and depending on where you fall on your, you know, when you're getting reevaluated versus when you're getting audited, there may be years between when, like, you know, if somebody's actually checking to see what's happening. And so if, like, I know you had mentioned, like, you talk kind of internally about to make sure that's not the same year that you,
Yeah.
you
for
know,
the
both
audits.
agencies are doing that. But still, I think there may be some that are not getting hit by you or an internal audit for a few years. And the only thing that we have to verify that they are providing what they're saying they're providing is a document that they're signing to say we provided it. So just me personally, I think you know, I would like to see something a little bit more aggressive, just because, you know, these are programs that we're trusting with our most vulnerable students. And they are charging a hefty, you know, amount to provide that. And so there should be better ways for us to guarantee that that is actually happening, especially when it comes to making sure those student needs are being met, which, especially in that report, some of which look like it was not. So go ahead. I know you want
Just
to
a,
comment.
yeah, just a quick comment on that. So all of the students that attend an out-of-district placement or within an approved private we do monitor them through CT. We have a statewide system called CT SEDS. Their IEPs are there. So all of our general supervision activities that we do on an annual basis include those students there. So I'm going to give you an example. If there was a student that didn't have their annual review, we would know that in an ABSEP without the standard review process. That's not the standard approval process, but they're monitored just like all of the students are in our public school settings on an annual basis to ensure they have their 3-year reevaluations, their annual reviews, to make sure that transition age students have in their IEPs post-secondary education, employment, and independent living if necessary. All those things happen for students that attend ABSEPs as well. So we're not, I can show you what the attestation looks like related to the standards, staff certification, background checks, fingerprinting, the population, the number of students they have. If there are any changes to the program, they have to submit that information to us, which triggers some activities. So there are other touch points that we have around the IEP specifically that I just wanted to point out.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, but the IEP is a way for, I guess, SD to ensure that some of those things on compliance are being met. But like, for example, an IEP could say, the private the APSEP did their annual reviews, that they're providing XYZ service, but whether or not there's a certified individual actually providing that service, the IEP can say that, but doesn't verify it. That is only human to human contact, like we would actually see, or we would see it on the books, or we would see it somewhere. So, and technically that could be said, by the way, for any district, right? That's not just for APSEPs. But I'm just saying this is a private facility versus, let's just say, Windsor Public Schools. I'm from Windsor, so I'm just going to call it Windsor. But Windsor has a Board of Education that reviews a lot of those, right? So if Windsor saw, hey, why aren't any of our teachers certified? Why don't we have certified teachers on the books? There are elected board members that call that into question. But these private programs, they don't have elected bodies that look over. And so then it becomes a state responsibility to look at them a lot more aggressively than we do at our public entities, because they, again, have oversight locally. But these state-approved programs do not have local oversight. And I know technically the district could go into at certain times or could review, but again, I just, like if you have X number, whatever number of students in so many different programs, how many times you're going to actually make the rounds to go in and actually verify that whatever service that the program is saying happens. So I wanted to just express that concern and like your entity is doing that oversight process. If there are other ways that we can support your ability to do more, let us know what that is. If there's some way that your hands are tied legally, that you can't do what you need to do to ensure that service is actually being provided, we'd love to know that, right? Because you're the one that is overseeing that, and you're the one that your entity is the one that's going in. And so, especially when it comes to oversight and I don't always want to just stress costs, because I know that, service is important, but to make sure services are happening, but then that the costs match the services that are happening. So for example, if the private provider is saying, we can't find any certified staff to provide speech, then you shouldn't be charging for speech services if you're not providing speech, right? So it needs to match. You're charging for speech, but you don't have speech therapists. That doesn't, so all those kinds of other things that technically could, again, IEP would show, yeah, the student receives speech, but is there a speech therapist license that's in there that's actually providing that speech for that many hours? Again, I would say in a public school, you would assume that the superintendent and the board, and we all know that I'm a teacher. Like this morning, we had a board walkthrough. We have walkthroughs all the time where Board of Educations have, data teams. So public schools have local oversight. But these other providers don't have that level, and these are providers that cost obviously a lot more and that deal with a very vulnerable population. So I would like to see that oversight increased to make sure that the services are actually being provided, and to make sure that the costs are actually reasonable to what they are doing, and that they match the service that's being provided. And so in any way that we could kind of equip you with more ability to be able to do that, definitely let us know. And that's not necessarily today. I mean, even as like you're developing this process of what that looks like, if there are ways that your hands are tied and that you're not able to technically go in and there are legislative fixes that could correct that, I think, I know I speak for myself, but I think just based on what our conversations have been here in the committee, I think we'd be interested in looking at that this session. So I just ask for, let me know what you need to be able to do that.
Thank you.
And then lastly, this might not be something you have readily available, but just roughly, I think we have about 4,000 students that are outplaced in this state. Roughly what percentage of those go to the for-profit schools, if we can get? And I know we have about 23 out of the 88 that are for-profit, but just would like to know how many students are being serviced in for-profit. And I know we have a list publicly on that the state maintains of the programs, but if they provide specific, like what are services that they're providing, even these for-profits. So if it's just behavioral, if it's just autism, for it's just specific disability, or it's just universal for all, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if we have any other comments or questions. So thank you for being here to provide all this information. I know there were a number of kind of questions that came up. So whatever information you can provide, we'll share it with the committee. But thank you so much for staying for so long and providing so much good information for us to use going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.